Level 1. The Outcrop. It starts with a satellite map and a lawyer who specializes in maritime gray zones. You're staring at a jagged limestone spire jutting out of international waters, too small to belong to any nation, too remote for anyone to have bothered claiming it, sitting exactly 200 nautical miles outside the nearest country's exclusive economic zone. On paper, it's nothing, a navigational hazard, a footnote in a shipping almanac. To you, it's the last unclaimed square inch of Earth where the rules haven't been written yet. Your lawyer explains the loophole slowly, like she said it 100 times to 100 men exactly like you. Under the Montevideo Convention, statehood requires a permanent population, a government, and the capacity to enter relations with other states. Nobody said the population had to be large. Nobody said the government had to be more than one person, standing on a rock, holding a flag he printed himself. You charter a boat. You bring a surveyor, a structural engineer, and a case of champagne you don't open yet. You don't know it yet, but you've just taken the first step into a project that will cost you more money than most countries' annual budgets, put you on watch lists on 4 continents, and eventually force you to decide how far above the law a person can actually get before the law simply stops being the thing that's chasing you. Level 2. The Claim. The legal work takes 18 months and a team of 4 attorneys who bill more per hour than most people make in a week. You identify the gray zone precisely. Waters unclaimed by any coastal state, outside the continental shelf extensions everyone else forgot to file paperwork for. You deploy a rapid response security detail, 6 former Special Forces contractors, ex-Legion, ex-SAS, men who don't ask why a rock in the ocean needs armed protection before there's anything on it worth protecting. They establish physical presence first, a flag, a shipping container retrofitted as a shelter, a generator running 24 hours a day so the outpost never technically goes dark, because darkness, your lawyer tells you, reads as abandonment in a maritime court. You file with a friendly registrar, a small nation that for a fee that would buy a house in most cities will formally acknowledge your outcrop's claim to statehood in exchange for looking the other way on what you build there. It's not full international recognition. It doesn't need to be. It only needs to be enough ambiguity that no navy wants to spend the political capital removing you. The first night you sleep on the rock yourself in a shipping container, listening to the waves, you feel something you've never felt in 40 years of accumulating wealth inside other people's countries and playing by other people's rules. You feel for the first time unowned. Level 3. The habitat construction begins with barges, dozens of them hauling modular housing units engineered in a Rotterdam shipyard specifically for hostile marine environments. Self-sustaining, storm-rated, designed to qualify as permanent structures under the exact language of maritime micronation precedent. You're not building a house. You're building a legal argument made out of concrete and steel, desalination plants, hydroponic greenhouses that can feed 40 people indefinitely, a landing pad, a deep-water dock capable of servicing your yacht, converted 190-foot research vessel retrofitted with a submersible garage, because at this level, transportation and infrastructure are the same category of expense. Your architect, when you hire her, tells you something that sticks. Most rich men build monuments to be looked at. You're building something that has to be legally invisible and structurally undeniable at the same time. You start sleeping 4 hours a night. Not from anxiety, from momentum. You review blueprints the way other men review stock portfolios, obsessively at 3 a.m., lit by the blue glow of a tablet in a hotel room 8,000 miles from the rock that's slowly becoming the only place on Earth you actually own outright. Level 4. The Fortification. Physical sovereignty is easy compared to what comes next, making yourself untouchable in a world where every transaction leaves a digital fingerprint. You commission underwater server farms, data centers submerged in pressurized housings just off your territorial waters, cooled by the ocean itself, jurisdictionally ambiguous by design. Nobody can subpoena a server that technically sits in water nobody owns. You hire a former NSA contractor, the kind of man who left the agency under circumstances nobody discusses, to build your architecture, encrypted communications routed through servers with no fixed legal jurisdiction, financial systems that clear transactions through your own micronation's newly minted banking charter before anyone downstream can trace where the money actually originated. He tells you, on your second meeting, that what you're building isn't a fortress, it's a black box. Information goes in. Nothing verifiable comes out. You nod like you understood the distinction before he made it. Though the truth is, you're only now beginning to understand the shape of what you're becoming. Your name starts appearing less in public records. Your assets start appearing more inside structures with names like holding companies inside trusts, inside foundations registered to an island that technically doesn't exist on any map your accountant's software recognizes. Level 5. The Mercenaries bomb with 6 contractors becomes 40, then 80. You stop calling it security. Your head of operations, a former Foreign Legion officer who now answers only to you, calls it a sovereign defense apparatus. The distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because a defense apparatus can legally purchase things a private security force cannot. Patrol boats, surveillance drones that loiter above your waters 24 hours a day, a small fleet of armored transport vehicles for an island with no roads longer than 400 meters. Because at this level, excess isn't wasteful. It's a signal, broadcast to anyone considering testing your claim, that the cost of finding out what happens next is higher than they want to pay. You attend your first coordination meeting with 3 other private island owners, men whose names you recognize from finance magazines and one whose name you don't recognize at all, which unsettles you more than anything discussed in the meeting itself. They talk about mutual defense the way normal men talk about carpooling. You realize, driving back to your dock in a boat armed with equipment technically classified as military hardware in 6 different countries, that you have built yourself a small army and that you did it so gradually, one justified purchase at a time, that you never once had to consciously decide to become the kind of man who owns one. Level 6. The recognition. You need one more country to formally recognize you. Just one, on paper, to trigger the diplomatic domino effect that turns a fortified rock into an actual sovereign entity with actual standing in actual international courts. You find it in a small nation drowning in debt, a foreign minister who takes your calls personally, a recognition agreement structured as a strategic economic partnership that nobody in that country's parliament reads past the first page, the one listing the number of zeros in the signing bonus. The recognition is worth less than the paper it's printed on, legally speaking. Politically, it's worth everything, because now there is a sovereign state, however small, however bribed into existence, willing to stand up in an international forum and say, "Your rock is real." You throw a party to celebrate. You invite the finance magazine men. You do not invite the man whose name you still don't recognize, and you notice, with a small chill you don't examine too closely, that he shows up anyway. Level 7. The economy. A nation needs an economy, so you build one. A tax structure with a corporate rate of 0%. A banking charter that asks no questions about the origin of deposits. A residency program that sells passports to anyone who can wire 8 figures within 30 days. Money starts arriving that you didn't personally invite. Wealth from places your compliance officer flags in reports you've stopped reading carefully. You tell yourself the due diligence process is thorough. You tell yourself this the same way you told yourself, at level 1, that you were only claiming an outcrop, not building a place where consequences go to die. Your banking charter processes more volume in its first year than most mid-sized countries' entire GDP, and almost none of it touches a jurisdiction with the authority or the appetite to ask where it came from. You hire a compliance team specifically to make the operation look compliant, a distinction that used to bother you and now simply reads on a balance sheet as a line item labeled regulatory optics. Level 8. The trade routes. The shipping lane running past your territorial waters carries 9% of the world's container traffic. You didn't choose the location for that reason, originally. Now it's the only reason that matters. You start acquiring stakes, quietly, through shell entities 3 layers removed from your name, in the port authorities and logistics firms that control choke points on either side of the lane. Nothing illegal, individually. Collectively, you now sit in a position to slow, redirect, or quietly tax a meaningful percentage of global maritime trade. And you've never once had to break a single law to get there, because the law was never written with someone like you in mind. A shipping conglomerate's CEO flies out to your island personally to negotiate preferred passage terms. He calls it a partnership. You both know what it actually is. You realize, watching his helicopter lift off your pad, that you have stopped being a man who owns a private island. You have become a variable that global commerce now has to account for. Level 9. The investigation. Governments notice, eventually. They always do, just usually too late to matter. A joint task force forms quietly across 3 intelligence agencies, tracking financial flows that all seem to terminate at a banking charter belonging to a nation most of their analysts have never heard of. They build a file. They give you a code name, because your actual name is buried under so many holding structures that even a subpoena couldn't reach it cleanly. Your former NSA architect intercepts the first inquiry before it reaches a formal request. He tells you calmly that the investigation will go nowhere, not because you're innocent, but because prosecuting you would require at least 4 governments to agree on jurisdiction over a rock that legally belongs to none of them. You believe him. You've believed men like him for 8 years now, and it's gotten you this far. But you start sleeping 4 hours a night again, and this time, it isn't momentum. Level 10. Above the law. You stand on the observation deck of your island at sunset. Limestone spire beneath your feet, submerged data centers cooling silently offshore, a small navy anchored in your harbor, a banking charter processing money for people whose names you'll never learn, a shipping lane bending slightly around your interests every single day whether anyone notices or not. You are, by any functional measure, above the law, not because you broke it, because you built something the law was never designed to reach in the first place, a jurisdiction of one, recognized just enough to be real, ambiguous just enough to be untouchable. Your head of operations approaches with a report. Another private island coalition wants a meeting. Terms of mutual recognition. The unnamed man will be there again. You realize, looking out at water that legally answers to no one, that sovereignty was never actually the thing you were chasing. It was the silence. The specific, total silence of a world with no one left who has the standing to tell you no. You say yes to the meeting. You always say yes now. There's no one left whose permission you're required to ask. And somewhere in the 8 years it took to build that fact, you stopped being sure whether that made you free or simply alone at a scale no one before you ever reached.